Hello, I'm Grant Bartley. What would it mean to do the right thing economically as a society? In this video, I'm going to consider economics from a Christian point of view. Because of its size, and because of its theoretically unavoidable interest in social issues, the Church is still a major player in the global economy. By the Church, I mean the set of all those who believe that Jesus Christ is Lord and trust Him for eternal life. More specifically, Christian formulations of my opening economic question are: what form would the economy of God take? What would economic righteousness be? In Matthew chapter 6, Jesus tells us not only to pray that God's kingdom would come, but also to seek first His kingdom and righteousness. What would the economy of the kingdom of God on earth look like? I will argue that the global church should take up a form of economic activity where it can grow free from the world's financial clutches to live in good ecological and social stewardship. You might ask, why should Christians care? Christians should be striving to create a Christian economy for a few good reasons. Clearly, Christians should love. Yet love surely crucially includes striving to create good conditions of life for those you love. Creating the best economic conditions is about creating the best conditions for life and flourishing. Perhaps surprisingly then, creating the most beneficial economic processes is what it means to most effectively love in society in the long run. Moreover, implementing good economic ideals is strategically fundamental to the Church demonstrating Christ. Since economic processes determine the conditions of human existence, in order to best express Christian values, the Church must implement an economy which expresses Christian values, both in its functioning and in its outcome. In other words, to best facilitate the coming of God's kingdom, by the Spirit's lead, the Church will need to create a true Christian economy. Creating the best conditions for human life and flourishing has particular requirements in this age of increasing ecological crisis. So it wouldn't do for the Church to miss the signs of the times concerning the need to get its economic thinking in order, or at least for the need for it to do some economic thinking. I could ask, what's the point of promoting personal good if you're not preaching and acting against a systematically bad context for life? You're bailing out a sinking moral ship. From a lack of thoughtfulness or imagination, many Christians even explicitly approve of the global dominance of market economics, thus implicitly approving the materialism, gluttony, rapacity, exploitation and corruption which are the natural results of the pure drive for profit, so giving their blessing to all the psychological and social dysfunction and unhappiness which trail in their wake. Good stewardship this is not. The murderous inconsistency in a Christian advocacy of corrupt economics is certainly not lost on the world being preached to. All these reasons demand that the Church should try to create a world both with and in the form of good economic principles. Our most pressing concern is to reorganize the global economy into ecological sustainability. This implies that to achieve good economic ideals, the Church cannot now utilize the profit-driven model capitalism uses, at least without engineering in some righteous breaks. What might a global green economy look like? Here I want to examine some principles this might involve, and what these principles immediately imply. This scant sketch is meant to show both a method of developing a good global economics and an ideal of what society might look like. The first conceptual distinction to make here is that, economically speaking, effectiveness means maximising the provision of goods and services, whereas efficiency means minimising resource use and waste. A pertinent principle emerging from this distinction is, when resources are plentiful, use an effective system of resource use and delivery. When resources are scarce, use an efficient system of resource use and delivery. The free market is an effective means of producing and distributing goods, meaning that it's very good at facilitating the production and distribution of the things necessary for life. But it's not efficient in its use of resources to do so. There's a lot of waste. The motive in the market is profit, not sustainability. However, to create a stable global society, we need to create an efficient global economy, because we need to develop an economic process which can remain at relatively low resource use. In other words, we need to change the core ideal of the global economy from one of maximising the production of goods and services to one of minimising our resource use. Now, the first ideal of any good society is the provision of the basic needs for all members of that society. Another deal-breaking social ideal is to maximise a person's freedom to determine their own thought and life. Putting an ecological spin on these two principles, the basic ideal for a sustainable global society is the provision of the basic needs of all in an ecologically stable way, while maximising people's freedom to determine their own thought and life. This formula recognises provision and freedom as the twin foundational principles of society in an ecological context. So let me outline a model for an environmentally stable economy, both freedom promoting and an efficient way of supplying primary needs. The environmentally friendly model I'm recommending I call a two-system economy. It also has significant similarities to what is called a mixed economy. The dual economy is meant as an antidote to our present free market overstimulus to resource overuse through the pursuit of profit. As the name suggests, the most prominent characteristic of a two-system economy is that it involves two economic systems. However, instead of being in conflict, these economic systems work alongside each other, even complementing each other. These two systems are the market system and the social system. I also call a social economy a provision economy. Social economic activity is distinct from market economic activity. These two systems could even work independently, yet on this model they're interacting, even entwined with each other, by which I mean they're part of the same society. Only working together can these economic systems yield ecologically stable provision and freedom, I think. How is a two-system economy supposed to work to meet the needs of global society in an ecologically stable way, in principle? The two systems have different functions to fulfill. The first aspect of the dual economy is the familiar free market economy, or at least its evolved future equivalent, whose ideal is to pursue profit or wealth. However, the ideal for the social economy is for all people to have access to the necessities of life as a right. The idea behind this is that when the necessities are provided for people as their right, they'll be liberated from the survival fears that force them into whatever available profiteering niche free market economics offers them, even the production of useless junk. People will be free to contribute to society in ways suited to their skills, desires, and training. If people are not freed from the fear of not getting what they need to survive, they'll still do whatever they can to free themselves from that fear. By the necessities of life, I mean first food, shelter, clothing, security, and a basic medical care. Then, as the social economy develops, education, more advanced medical care, and whatever else necessary for life to have enough quality to be desirable. This ideal may be familiar to you in the guise of the idea of universal basic income, the idea that, as a right, everybody should be given enough money to live on. Universal basic income is perhaps the most obvious way to fulfill the social idea that the necessities of life are a right for all, though it's not the only plausible way. Furthermore, a social economy needs to consider not only how the means for life are distributed through society, as the universal basic income idea does, but also how the means for life are produced. The purpose and so goal of the social economy is to create goods and services to fulfill basic needs while minimizing resource use, with the aim of providing for people's needs efficiently. In a market economy, the more economic output there is, the more profit there is. So immediately with free market economics there is pressure for economic growth, and with it unnecessary resource use. The aim of the social system is to ensure that people no longer must channel their needs for survival into the overproduction of goods and services, which implies the unnecessary use of resources. As significant social provision starts being achieved, people will start to be freed from the need to create profit by any means possible, and so be freed from unnecessary resource use. This is why the social economy is not a profit-oriented economy, it's a basic provision-oriented economy. The social economy would exist to produce and distribute goods and services for the needs of those who have not worked for it, as well as for those who have. This aspect will strike some, especially market enthusiasts, as too much like charity. But the provision ideal of the social economy is not about charity, it's about enlightened self-interest. Unless a social system freely provides, it will not create a buffer to the free market's expansionist resource overuse impulse. Byzantine sanctions upheld by Byzantine bureaucracies will develop to discourage abuses of the social system, just as occurs in contemporary welfare states. The simplest way to achieve ecological stability might be for governments to limit industrial output through legislation. However, this would mean we're no longer talking about a free market, but a controlled economy, albeit a somewhat capitalistic one. I don't recommend this simple market control route. To be any good, any new economy we work our way to constructing must not suffer the control problems that historically have been produced through the centralization of control and/or the monopolization of economic power, as is demonstrated by all the many tyrannies of both history and current affairs. On its own, it seems to contradict the freedom aspect of our ideals, not least because it threatens totalitarianism. If not totalitarianism, then at least authoritarianism has proved to be a virtually irresistible temptation for most commanders of most command economies. This is a basic factor in what went wrong with all the communist regimes. In practice, this means that there must be freedom for personal economic action. On our two-system model, the market system is what guarantees this freedom. Indeed, I think a free market is a necessary counterbalance to the totalitarian tendencies of any command economy. If only for this reason, the free market must be preserved in any ecological revolution, by legal statute if necessary. In fact, to have a global economy without a free market aspect would be as disastrous as it's proving to be having a global market economy without some economic aspect slowing the market's expansion down. So let me be clear that the social economy is not conceived as replacing the market economy, but as running alongside it, in order to put the brakes on its excesses, without limiting the market's own freedom. A good economy must make allowance for the free production and distribution of goods, including artworks and other luxuries. But a healthy social system will also be opposed to the pathologies of a consumerist mentality. I'm not interested in influencing or adjusting the market. The market system, I suppose, will evolve in whatever unforeseeable way. But the social economy is an independently functioning economy. The goal of the social system is to increasingly produce and distribute the resources necessary to achieve full basic provision, aiming to eventually become completely self-sufficient in doing so. In practice, this means state or parastate organizations producing and distributing what necessities they can in enlightened competition with the free market sector. Under sustainability constraints, the social economy would work to provide these things in the most resource-efficient way, from the start dedicating part of its output to benefiting the wider world, not just those producing and distributing its goods and services. This economic system exists to free those caught under the economy's wheel. 10% of productivity or of economic capacity would be an appropriate standing minimum to divert those outside the system. Although the more the process can extend benefit, the healthier it is, generally speaking. The measure of a provision economy's success may indeed be the extent to which it can provide to others, and also, necessarily, to itself. The social economy must itself at first expand its productivity until it's big enough to fulfill its mandate of making basic provisions available for all. But the leaders of the social economy must remember that it's aiming for efficiency. The waste which has been characteristic of socialist economies should be absolutely striven against in our social economy, since the efficient use of resources is this system's main raison d'etre. As the social economy increasingly produces what it needs for itself as well as for others, it will increasingly break away from reliance on the market economy. The size of the free market's labour force will shrink as labourers begin to be freed from being forced to contribute to it. Often their labour will be transferred into the full provision economy. But the market could never disappear, since there will always be many who will want to gain materially from life far beyond a subsistence level, in wealth display, for instance. But two-system economics is about providing an alternative to economic overproductivity, not about wiping out people's economic independence. I think that as people are freed from the requirement to overuse resources, the market economy will increasingly sell the goods and services people actually want to create or do, when they're not forced to do so by pure material needs. The market's labour force would have the opportunity to sell to the market according to their desires rather than through the coercion of their pure survival needs. Thus, in a well-functioning two-system economy, the market side of the economy would be a truly free market. This would itself be a very economically efficient outcome. I also think it's how we might fulfill the human rights we often claim people to have. It will also mean a society where people are freed from fear for their basic needs, which would be great for social psychological health. In contrast to the principles at work in our present psychologically toxic culture, where for profit the media constantly pumps materialism into our minds. So, alongside the market economy, we need to globally develop a social economy, that is, a green economy which works to provide the means of life for people as a right. Provision as a human right is one of its mottos. The dual economy will not prove an exception to the instinct people have for forming status hierarchies, however egalitarian society might otherwise become. The struggle to be alpha and the politics involved are a given for mammals such as us. But I think the most intelligent way to deal with our inescapable animal sexually selective impulses for status is to first determine what sort of economic arrangements we want, then let the status process rearrange itself around those ideals. This is in contrast to our free market economic process, which is a random reaction to status needs, and also in contrast to a process whose dogma destructively pretends that social hierarchies don't exist. For example, extreme communist egalitarianism. The point I'm making is that the human competitions for status should not be ignored or denied, but rather that the unavoidable dramas of life are best enacted in an optimally beneficial and ever-improving environment. My ideal is that the resource-providing social system will grow to increasingly provide the means of subsistence for the world as a basic human right. That would be proper human flourishing. I once heard a rabbi give a good criterion for a desirable society, which makes it a good standard for gauging social health. In a good society, he said, citizens would be rich enough psychologically as well as materially to be able to give generously to others. But with a provision economy, I'm talking about an economic process geared towards generosity. By this reasoning, this would be the healthiest sort of economy possible. Any economy must possess the resources from which everything necessary for life can be made. And a provision economy must make stuff to provide with, both for others and for its own workforce. So it needs to build itself up. To fulfill its purpose, a social economy must create its own production and distribution system. A civilized, self-sufficient economy needs to work from beneath the ground up, with the resources necessary for mineral extraction, up to farming facilities, across to other primary resource production, such as housing and other capabilities for building, and finally develop the rest of the means of the producing and distribution of resources, everything necessary to build a society, through to the production and distribution of high tech. The social system can only hope to succeed in supplying our needs if it comes to run mines, farms, factories, transport, and shops. It isn't even going to get off the ground if it doesn't own land. And as it grows, that economy must continue to develop its resource production, processing, and distribution. Some of the excess capacity beyond sufficiency should be kept for internal growth and for internal material improvement through research and development. The social system's workers themselves have a right to rising standards of living in sustainable ecological ways. We should always remember, however, that the social system is about fulfilling needs rather than desires, with a little extra for luxuries and for useful but not necessary things. Sustainability is the core motivator of this model. The raw ideal is to make and take only what's necessary for thriving. Desires can be left to the market side of the economy. If people want a lot more stuff than is basically provided for them, then they'll have to work within the free market. The market will provide opportunities for status-needy people who feel they must be rich. No change in the market there then. But it also shows that no change in human nature is required for the dual economy. The significant difference in a dual economy from today's market monopoly is that nobody is forced by need to make the stuff that no one needs. Here, people will only make and sell far beyond their needs if they have a strong desire for status or some other strong psychological motivating factor. To begin with, a social economy must be funded by the market, because to begin with there's no other source for resources. So if we're talking a state-run social economy, for example, we're talking taxes. External funding could come from voluntary contributions or investment. A provision economy could even temporarily be a profit-based system, financing its growth by selling some of what it makes and does. A similar idea is for people to be shareholders in aspects of this economy. Thus, the social economy could even work on a competitive and perhaps a semi-capitalist basis, maybe right up until it becomes independently functioning. There will be trade between the two economies. There will also need to be means of exchange within the provision economy itself. A mature social economy's wealth could be rationed in various ways to prevent people from taking more than they need or is fair. My first thought is to develop a social currency using cheap tech or even the low-tech option, even ration books. But first, the bigger question needs to be answered. What might a provision economy look like in general form? What political form should the social provision economy have? A social economy could, for example, be a state or a state-like organisation, like a welfare state, but one that's aiming for full self-sufficiency and thus independence as a fully functioning state. A welfare state is in many ways a good example of a social provision economy, except in one vital respect. Welfare states are funded by taxing the free market. Since it relies on the market, a welfare system cannot limit the market as it grows. It's vital that the social economy evolves away from dependence on market funding, otherwise it will remain only a welfare state, with no ecological gain since it financially depends on the market to operate. Also, the tax burden needed to run a welfare state often irritates the people who unwillingly pay for it. Taxation stress limits are socio-economic fault lines, meaning that overtaxation is disastrous on a political scale. This problem is potentially unlimited when hooked into the potentially unlimited uses of a welfare system. There is no upper limit to what a welfare state could theoretically provide medically for its clients, for example. So, a simple welfare state is an inadequate concept for our purposes. A provision economy must differ from a welfare state, at least by evolving away from its dependence on the market. This means it must come to itself provide the resources for itself. as well as providing the resources necessary to fulfill its purpose of mass need alleviation. Another potentially plausible model for a social economy would be a green command economy. That is, with its processes commanded from the top down. Like a welfare state, a command economy has a central nervous system, an intricate bureaucracy involved in organising the distribution of resources for society. But unlike a welfare state, a command economy also organises the production of the goods it distributes. Should we want our social-oriented economy to be a command economy? Unfortunately, the most glaring examples to us of command economies are the bloody communist attempts at social provision. But a command economy is not obliged to follow communist models. Ancient Egypt sometimes had a command economy too, as utilised by Joseph, head government grain controller from the Book of Genesis. And the Egyptian economy was theocratic rather than egalitarian, justified by Osiris or Horus rather than by Marx or Mao. Nor is it necessary in a command economy that all commands come from the top. With any command structure, a better model than a simple pyramid involves a high distribution of responsibility across the system, which adds intelligence and flexibility into the system. Power for decisions is best placed on the ground and localized. Localizing choice is putting power into the hands of people who know what they're doing because they do it. In any complex social structure, there must be some body invested with ultimate decision-making power for those tricky disputes. But generally speaking, the lighter its influence, the better. Unfortunately, history indicates a strong tendency for the centralization of power. A major part of the role of the market in a dual economic system is to minimize the possibility of a monopoly of power. In the old days, they used to call the monopoly of power tyranny. A more liberal model for a provision economy is a network of provision-oriented systems formed by societies in association. In other words, a federation. A provision federation would not take most commands from any one centre, but would instead be coordinated by a desire to cooperate. We might say by a saintly, invisible hand. There could be many different provision societies and leaders, just as there are many corporations and CEOs, or many states and rulers. As long as they cooperate to fulfill the provision mandate, this would be a much better system than through any central state, in many ways. Clearly, there are many ways the social half of the dual economy could work. I don't know which would be best. The point is to test them and to see how they do. A real attempt to stop the wound of our economic success will probably involve several approaches, wisely incorporating what we can of what's useful. Since the human race already has the resources to feed, house, educate, and to a basic extent medicate everyone, doing so is a matter of setting up the right processes. The rest is a matter of political or popular will. Now, quick political revolution is unlikely to aid social stability. Violent revolution means bloodshed, and usually eventually totalitarianism, and a rapid increase in mortality rate. A revolutionary fast fix for the global economy would probably be as disastrous as the disaster it would be ignited to prevent, only shifting the epicenter. My aim is to see the good in society grow, in the sense of both expand and improve. People starving and dying as a result of overthrowing a functioning economy is disastrous. So, our search for social stability, which is the reason for our revolution in the first place, must instead involve a gradual development away from our present way of doing business, organically implementing long-term processes. The image I have is of the social economy growing like a tree. So this is only revolution in the sense that it aims to produce radical or fundamental change. The aim of the dual economy is humanity's resource use reduction will happen in the least unpleasant way we can engineer. The idea is to peacefully instigate a careful change in the nature of the global economy to sustainable provision. It's best to think evolution, not revolution. Having said this, I think we'd better start acting soon. Yet things will probably have to get significantly worse in the developed world before the powerful take the need for economic reconfiguration seriously enough to start doing it. I hope by then it won't be a scandal of too little too late on an apocalyptical scale. Whatever combination of forms we opt to start aiming for, the first step in achieving good social goals is communicating the goals into society. When a consensus of critical enough mass has been achieved, a realistic working towards not destroying the biosphere will commence. So what might an economy that expresses Christian values look like? Capitalism's resource use expansionism is out. Resource use management is coming in, or humanity is just digging itself a deep hole on an industrial scale. In other ways, a good Christian economy would have the general basic features of any good economy. The ability to provide for the needs of the members of that economy, materially and otherwise, and the freedom to act on as wide a variety of choices compatible with the same freedom of choice for all. So the first clear aspect of a Christian economic ideal should be the provision of people's needs in an increasingly ecologically sustainable way. Indeed, the social provision part of the dual economy applied to the Church says that the worldwide Church should work to develop a green economy which provides necessary material and other needs and services as a human right for those both inside and also outside the Church. This social system would exist to self-sufficiently and in a green manner provide not only to its own members, but also to its non-members, not only as a display of love, but to cushion the expansion of the free market by being an alternative source of provision. The ecclesiastical economic enterprise ought to dedicate at least 10% of its productivity and/or resources to providing for outsiders. In that way, the Church would tithe for the world. But for the fullest blossoming of the most blessed economy, I'd recommend applying a maximally benign ideal, such as benefit wider society as much as you can with integrity. Christian ethics, which is to say Jesus Christ, clearly sanctions material provision for the needs of others. If you doubt that, read Matthew, Mark, or Luke. One short work of providing for the needs of others is love. So, with what I call a provision ideal for society, we're starting to glimpse what the kingdom of God would look like in economic terms. This doesn't mean that all Christians do this, but it does mean that the Church should take the social provision mandate seriously. If nothing else, the Church taking its social provision role seriously would take the hegemony of social provision away from the hands of states, which operates through welfare systems. So this could be the opening up of another dimension of human freedom. The ecclesiastical economic organisation I'm arguing for here must become a self-standing economic organisation. Creating a self-sufficient Christian economy is necessary to free the Church from the economic and political processes that it's tied up with, so that it can have the freedom to do what it's supposed to do without such worldly strings attached. Being freed from those economic processes by having its own means of generating and distributing resources could mean that the body of Christ can, for instance, get out of capitalism's loop of increasing consumerism for the sake of profit, and instead start operating a green, sustainable, providing, free economy. Insofar as the body of Christ does not become economically self-sufficient, it still depends on our global economy's provision for its resources, so it's still tied to how the world does business. Nevertheless, the funding for the Church's provision economy must start with the generosity of people earning their living through the market. There isn't anywhere else the seed fund could come from. Vitally, I think that the Church generating its own system for the production and distribution of resources will be necessary to fulfill Revelations 18, verse 4, which says, "Come out of her, my people, so that you don't partake of her sins, and don't receive her plagues." Here, her means Babylon, which symbolizes or stands for the world's political and economic system. This verse can be interpreted as calling the Church to separate itself from the world's corrupt economic processes before the kingdom of God can manifest in its fullest extent. Although there are many possible ways this might happen, to me it means growing an independent, self-sufficient economy which demonstrates better value than the world's values by living them out. All this implies that the Church must do more than merely condemn the world's malign practices, sheepishly indeed. The Church must build a good alternative, or two, or three, to the present globally toxic resource-abusing money-making. So the global Church must strive to create a self-sufficient green social provision economy. I ask the Christians watching this, what else could a well-functioning, specifically Christian economy look like? One biblical qualification to people having what they need for life as a right, as I'm supposing here, is that St. Paul says that those who shall not work shall not eat. Let's look at just one way this command might be integrated into the economic ideal of provision as a human right. Each week, the adults in a family do a certain number of hours of work benefiting themselves or others. This idea goes back at least as far as Thomas More in the 16th century, and it seems to work well in a communal or kibbutz setting. We might say, for instance, that each person who can work whose family is provided for by the provision economy owes work in that economy of, let's say, 24 hours a week. More work is good if you want to do more, of course, up to some healthy limit. But the value of work is not in terms of profit, but in terms of the benefit it brings to yourself and to others. Obviously, some people are incapable of work. They should be provided for charitably. Paul's injunction is against those who can work but are too lazy or distracted to do so. It's necessary to stipulate that any form of focused and constructive activity could count as work, including financially unrecognizable work such as parenting, studying, training, and most artistic creativity. But creativity should be resourced by an ecclesiastical economy, since creativity is an imitation of the Creator. There will be flexibility in the application of these ideals, of course, as well as allowance for holidays. The system is for the people, not the people for the system, after all. The freedom aspect of our two social foundations means that the economic processes Christians should grow also ought to enable the freedom of people, especially the freedom of people to benignly contribute to society as they're best suited to as individuals. The Church would be justified in not subsidizing anti-Christian or destructive activities. Otherwise, a Christian economy should avoid being controlling, which is authoritarianism. Freedom is a core goal for human society, so free thought and speech ought not to be penalized by the providers of resources to thinkers and speakers. That censorship would turn a provision economy into a control economy, and historically, control economies don't take long to turn bad. Freedom is lost without freedom of conscience, which implies the freedom to act on your conscience. Please note that this also generally means for Christians to be allowed to contribute to the greater good in the way they believe they've been gifted to do so by God, by preaching, missionary work, teaching, or medically, for example. We want an open society, or we're closed-minded. This requires financing even the thought we don't agree with. But as I say, this doesn't mean bankrolling violence, perversion, obscenity, or blasphemy. To expect Christians to support these things would be to expect them to go against their consciences, which is against their freedom. And here the conscience of the giver must trump the conscience of the receiver. I find one good initial form for an arguably Christian provision economy to be localized but internationally connected production and provision facilities coordinated through local churches. The idea here is of a federation of churches growing the church economy from the ground up. There may be many other forms an independent Christian economy may utilize. Anything that's good is good as far as I'm concerned. A Christian economy which values provision over profit, that is, which values love, surely God must bless once we start getting our attitudes right in it. All it requires is inspiration, imagination, and perspiration. The dual economy I argued for also has a free market side, which the Church might also be involved with. But in this video I'm not interested in the market side, except to note that there must be a free market economy simultaneous with the provisional economy for purposes of freedom of enterprise. Indeed, run this provision economy alongside a freely operating market system, and we have the makings of a good economic future for humanity. I'm sure many good Christians would argue for a model of Christian economics different from the provision model I've just sketched. But I'd be astounded if the ideal economy turned out to be unreconstructed free market capitalism. I want to add finally that there must be room for the refinement of these ideas and ideals. Perhaps there are better ways of tackling our world's growing environmental problems and resource divisions than a dual economic system. But in any future we would want individual action to be as free as possible, and the stable provision of everyone's basic needs. If you don't like my vision, think of something better. But we need to start applying solutions to our economic inefficiency and waste as soon as we've thought them through. Indeed, by the time humanity takes the need for global economic restructuring seriously enough to do it, in many ways it will be too late. So let's call this forward-thinking damage limitation. The most direct solution to our expanding resource use is rapid population cutting. If you think a two-system economy is an extreme solution, consider what we'd have to do to implement global population control before Gaia, Chaos and Malthus conspire to do it for us. Tough choice, do you think? What hope do you want for our future? Do you want our darkening narcotic dreams moving towards global catastrophe? Or do you want a world of realistic hope, achieved through a mentality which strives for the good of humanity and a constitutional agenda which backs this up? Leading questions, I'll admit. Despite everything, why not have a new dream of a world that's fair, peaceful, stable and generous, where there's increasing global cooperation for total provision for the world's population? Such a world must be the Christian social goal, surely.